Reality is grounded in the existence of God or the will of God. I do think you have to look at the world around you and you have to say there is an immense amount of suffering that goes on, which I don't believe an all-powerful, omniscient and good, morally good being would permit. If we believe that Jesus was God's son and God sent him to earth.
I most certainly do.
Right. So that happened about 2,000 years ago, right? And yet the world still has all of this suffering. So here's this supposedly all-powerful being who created the universe and everything, and who doesn't like the suffering that goes on, and who tried to do something about it 2,000 years ago, and yet the suffering is still going on. Doesn't seem to be really better. So it seems like he's a bungler. He made a bad mistake in thinking that sending his son to be crucified would somehow fix all the suffering in the world, and it plainly hasn't.
Well, actually,
Peter, we'll start with you. You're an atheist. Is that a point of view you adopted early on in your life?
I think I was probably never really a religious believer. Maybe, in my early teens I had some doubts and might have called myself an agnostic or something like that. But yes, for most of my life I've thought that, one can never totally exclude the possibility, I suppose, that there is a God. But it seems to me to be so improbable that I'm prepared to describe myself as an atheist.
Have you ever met any kind of argument that's given you pause for thought or had any inclination towards wishing that there might be a God?
Oh, one could always wish that there might be a God, as long as it was a better God than the one who is supposed to have created this world. I don't know that I would really want there to be such a God, but if there were a God who was going to look after everything and prevent the suffering of innocent beings, which is obviously a major feature of this world, that would be terrific. But, that's just like wishing there were fairies in the bottom of your garden.
I mean, from your point of view, do you tend to live your life and the ethics you espouse on the basis that this life is all we've got? This is obviously the one life we have. In a sense, you've made quite a name for yourself in this area, and in some respects, you've become quite a controversial figure as well to some groups. For instance, those who advocate for disability rights and so on have protested sometimes some of the statements you've made and the events you've been at. What is it about what you say that promotes that kind of a reaction, would you say?
If you're asking specifically about the reaction of people who are advocates for disability rights, it's probably merely that I state things that a lot of other people believe and indeed act on. Because after all, it's very common for people to have prenatal testing to see whether a fetus that they're carrying will have a disability. And in most of these cases, for example, if the disability is Down syndrome, typically something like 85% of the pregnant women will opt to terminate the pregnancy. And, I think that that's a defensible decision, and I think it's a defensible decision because I think it's reasonable to prefer to have a child without Down syndrome than one with Down syndrome. But because I say that explicitly, whereas other people are just doing it in the privacy of their medical clinics and decisions, I think I attract opposition from people who try to maintain that, life with disabilities is just as good, and we should not, as they say, discriminate against people with disabilities. But obviously, as I say, most people do discriminate, and I think that's a justifiable form of discrimination.
And when it comes to those kinds of issues, how do you arrive at the view that it's preferable, if you like, to not have a child with disability and so on? What's the ethic that you've been promoting?
The cases which are easiest are ones where the child will suffer significantly if they are born with a disability. And for that purpose, I'd have to say Down syndrome is probably not a good example. I chose it merely because it's a common disability and people do opt to terminate pregnancies with Downs. But the underlying ethic that I hold is a utilitarian ethic. That is, that we ought to try to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. We ought to try to promote the amount of well-being, happiness, however you want to describe it, in the world. And that I think that when you have children born, particularly with conditions that lead them to suffer greatly, or ones that are very difficult for their parents to cope with, and again, especially in societies that don't provide good support for that, then I think it's a reasonable choice to say, I'd rather have a child without that condition.
And this touches as well on the whole question of how you view a child as opposed to, say, a full-grown adult with lots of options in front of them and preferences and so on. You've developed the idea of personhood being the important thing when it comes to the kinds of value and rights we should ascribe to a person. Do you want to just explain what that is?
Yes, I'm happy to explain that, but it's slightly misleading to say that I think personhood is somehow important. I simply have used the term person to refer to beings who have a sense of their future and have preferences for that future, and that's really what I think is important and what underlies those decisions. And it's particularly clear where somebody is able to make choices. Then I think most people would see the difference between somebody who can make a choice whether they want to go on living or not. And I think under certain conditions we ought to try to respect that choice. And other circumstances where you have someone who's incapable of making that choice, possibly because they don't even have the sense of themselves as an independent being living at present but with a possible future.
And in that sense, for you, it's not so much about every human having a specific intrinsic value, but rather the value is more attached to any living thing's ability to reason, to have preferences, to have options,
or merely to be capable of suffering and enjoying their life. Right. Yes, certainly that's another aspect of my view, that I think what species a being is not in itself morally crucial. So if by being human you mean being a member of the species Homo sapien, and people do run those two things together, of course, then I don't think that that's in itself morally decisive. I think that we ought to look at beings for what they are. And, of course, there are some non-human animals who are more capable of understanding their situation in the world, of making choices, and certainly more capable of suffering and enjoying their lives than some very profoundly disabled, particularly profoundly intellectually disabled members of the species Homo sapien.
And obviously a lot of what you've done is focus on the ethics around animals and animal welfare and so on. That's an important part of your body of work. I suppose it has led to those situations where some people are concerned that you care more almost about animals than humans sometimes. I mean, that's obviously the way they characterize it. What would you say to those who, when you run that thought experiment about is it better to save a burning barn of pigs or, a 1-week-old baby and so on? Is that sort of helpful, or is that not really what you're talking about?
Well, it's certainly misleading to say that I care more about animals than about humans, and I'd like to know exactly what those people are doing for humans. Another aspect of my thought that we haven't yet talked about is that I think that people like us living in the affluent world ought to be doing a great deal more for people in extreme poverty than we are, and that's one of the easiest things we can do to help humans. The fact that there are people living on $2 a day, whereas we spend $2 on a cup of coffee without a moment's thought, says to me that there's something wrong with this. We could double somebody's income for the day by sending them the money we spend on a cup of coffee. And of course, there's many more expensive things than that we spend money on that we don't need. So I not only preach that, if you like, I act on it. I give at the moment something like 30 to 40% of what I earn to effective charities that are helping people in extreme poverty. So if the people who are saying that that's not enough, that we should all be doing more for our fellow humans, fine. I will admire them for doing that. But if they're not doing something comparable to that, I don't think they're in any position to say that I'm not caring about humans.
Religion does not own morality. Human empathy, fairness, and social cooperation can be studied without guessing what a God wants. Pew reports that 68% of Americans say belief in God is not needed to be moral, and that number is even higher in places like Sweden and Spain. If Christianity claims an all-good, all-powerful God, mass suffering is a serious problem. Isaiah 45:7 says God creates disaster, and Amos 3:6 says disaster comes from the Lord.
Interesting. We'll obviously be getting into the whole issue of the morality, evolution, the value of humans, with Andy Bannister, our other guest on the program today. Andy, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Justin. Always good to be here.
You've been engaging yourself in this area for some time. Before we get into that, just give us briefly your background. You've been a Christian for some time. What led you into wanting to engage in these sorts of areas of moral philosophy and, how we ascertain good and wrong and right and wrong?
Yeah, so I go on for a couple of questions. So I was born and raised in a Christian home, but I think as listeners of this show who've encountered me before have heard me tell the story, I kind of sort of drifted away from that, crisis of faith, call it what you like, in my kind of late teens, where really I think I came across the sort of thought that I need to ascertain and be able to know whether the things I've been taught are actually true. And so I actually began pressing into this sort of area of philosophy and the reasons why we believe the things that we do. And then I think what really was significant in my journey is my academic background is not in philosophy, though it's a fascinating conversation with Peter today. My PhD is Quranic studies, and I was having conversations with Muslim friends in London who were asking me very, very good questions about what I believed, and I realised I don't know anything about what they believed. And following that journey to its sort of logical conclusion actually led to doing a PhD and my doctoral work in Islamic studies, not biblical studies. And so my academic background is the study of the Quran. I'm still involved in lots of academic projects around that, but philosophy kind of developed as a sideline, because as like a lot of graduate and postgraduate students rather, I needed to pay the bills. And so when I was doing my PhD, I'd minored in philosophy earlier, and there was a need for the college where I was teaching to have somebody teach philosophy, so I sort of volunteered, and then not knowing actually that would be useful for these kind of public conversations, because part of my job at SOLAS is taking conversations about faith out of the doors of the church and into the public square. I spend most of my working life on university campuses, and actually philosophical questions come up.
Yeah.
And
on that basis, I'm sure you're regularly interacting with people who are atheistic in their outlook, like Peter. Where do you find the conversation often goes? Does it come to these kinds of philosophical issues around right and wrong, moral value, and so on?
I think what I really value about the chance to interact with Peter and Peter's work, which I read as a young student, I think is that actually so often when atheists and Christians or others discuss, we can get into these sort of abstract questions of whether sort of God theoretically exists or whatever. And but I like the kind of more practical end of philosophy. In fact, I remember, Peter, as I was sort of refreshing my memory of your biography, I think you said somewhere that when you were a young philosophy student, you decided you could sit around and just have meaningless conversations about whether tables exist, or you could actually get out there and think about things that really matter. And I think questions of right and wrong, what does the good life look like, how should we live, that kind of, as you might put it, the pointy end of philosophy kind of interests me, because it gets it grounded in the real world. And I find questions around good, evil, right, wrong, justice, meaning, purpose, those kind of things, they draw huge audiences, whether I'm talking in university settings or business settings. So that's what's intrigued me, that people are fascinated by the big questions of human life.
And ultimately, is it your view that these questions, the big questions, do point back to God at some level? Presumably you do believe that as a Christian.
Yeah, I think so. I think as Christians you have to be rather careful in going, how can we be good, therefore God? Why is there a universe, therefore God? I think that's quite a jump in logic, and philosophers and non-philosophers are sometimes guilty of, sort of doing great kind of leaps of thinking. But I do think I like the imagery of signposts. That's the one I often like to use with folks, of going, I think there are a number of signposts that, taken together, point in a significant direction. And I think it's interesting around the question of morality and human flourishing, which we're going to talk about in this conversation, that throughout the centuries, I think there's been a sort of a fair degree of recognition that I think having God there at the foundation does contribute something. And even if Peter and I end up disagreeing, which we will, I'd be foolish if I said that atheism had nothing to offer to the conversation. I don't think Peter, from what I've read, would turn around and dismiss the whole of Christian thinking on this. I think there's an area where we can have a discussion, and I think God contributes something to that discussion.
Well, maybe opening up this whole area of whether humans have some intrinsic moral value, or whether that's a wrong way of looking at the question. It's interesting that this is, I think, the 70th anniversary year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Peter. And I was just looking it up the other day, and Article 1 states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I mean, do you fundamentally agree with that, or would you put it a different way, or would you say, no, I don't think that's quite how it works?
It depends how we're supposed to take this, right? If we're supposed to take this as a kind of ringing declaration of things that we want to put out there and hold up in some way as a general principle, then I don't really have an objection to it. It may do quite a lot of good. But if we were to think of it as philosophers and to take it carefully and go through it word by word and analyze it, then I don't think that it is actually right. And also, of course, it is, as you say, a declaration of human rights, and as such, it tends to exclude, it does exclude non-human animals, and claims that all humans have dignity tend to imply that non-humans don't have the same kind of dignity that humans do, and I think that's not defensible either. Perhaps we should look at this term dignity for a start and say all humans are supposed to have this, whatever it means, right? So all humans includes those who are, let's say, anencephalics, right? An anencephalic is an infant born with only brain stem, with no cortex, with no capacity for consciousness. An anencephalic will not smile at his or her mother, won't recognize his or her mother, presumably is not capable of experiencing or feeling anything at all. But that is a human being, same chromosomes and so on. Now compare that with a chimpanzee or a horse, or choose your favorite non-human animal if you like. Why should we think that this human who can have no experiences has more dignity than the chimpanzee or the horse or the dog, who can respond in so many complex ways to their environment?
So essentially you would contest the statement, quite simply, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. There are some
that's right. There are exceptions.
And there are exceptions to that. And so in the sense that you couldn't, philosophically speaking, put your name to that kind of a declaration. You've done quite a bit of work on the idea of human rights.
Yeah, I mean, let me say a couple of things. One thing by way of response to Peter, but then flesh out my own thinking. I think what's interesting is, on the other hand, I think, Peter, while you take examples of human beings who are born profoundly disabled, I still think you'd recognise they had a degree of dignity there, because I think if you met a parent of a child who was born like that, who was proposing not just committing infanticide, but then chopping the corpse into little bits and frying them on the barbecue and having them with a salad, you'd think that in some way there'd been a failure of moral reasoning there to recognise that that even in that tragedy there's a degree of dignity. But I think the confusion around extreme disability is actually something it's interesting. If you look at some of the great kind of ethicists throughout the centuries, people like Hobbes, Locke, Kant argued the same thing, that the equality that we're talking about is not grounded in an ability that you have or you don't have, because that, of course, leads to a sliding scale that says, well, okay, maybe we say that rationality is what grants people, inclusion in the moral community.
Science keeps cutting down the wall. Religion builds between humans and animals. The Cambridge Declaration says mammals, birds, and even octopuses have the brain systems linked to conscious experience. Pain, fear, and awareness are not owned by humans. Christianity starts with human rule over animals in Genesis 1:28. It also permits slaves to be treated as property in Exodus 21:20-21. That is not a clean source for equal moral worth. It is ancient hierarchy wearing holy clothes.
Well, you're a brilliant philosopher. If we put you up next to Justin and we have to make a choice, Justin may not be part of our
I'd be mincemeat. Yeah.
You would be mincemeat.
We could just say there's a minimal threshold which Justin passes.
We could go that route, or we could go the route that Hobbes and Kant and others, and I think even some of the great utilitarian thinkers sort of flirted around with, that it's actually our capacities that are essential that are morally relevant. And I want to say something here about animal rights, Justin, because it was mentioned earlier on. That's a passion for me as well. And aside from the areas we disagree on, I think one thing I want to say that I hugely respect Peter for is that your book on animal liberation put animal rights and the way that we treat non-human creatures onto the table in a way that other books haven't. And so even though we may disagree on some things philosophically, I think you did a tremendous amount of good. What I would say, though, in terms of animal rights and justice for the animal kingdom, I want to say that's actually grounded in human dignity, because I have a duty to the animal kingdom to treat it in a particular way. Now, if we're dealing with a higher form of life, such as a pig or a chimpanzee, I think that duty's there. But I would extend that and say that even if I treated something that didn't have sentience wrong in a way that was ill, or if I went out and, for example, set fire to vast tracts of rainforest, plant life isn't sentient unless you follow one or two extreme philosophers, I have still behaved submorally. I have behaved in a way that's inappropriate towards that aspect of the natural world. But that's grounded in my duty that flows from my human nature, not in some sort of hypothetical set of rights that the entity out here has. So I think we might in some ways end up...
Whereas you do think that your duties to the anencephalic are grounded in some rights?
I think that it's again grounded in duty. I think that...
So you don't think there's a distinction then between the anencephalic and the pigs or the chimpanzees?
No, I think I come back to where Justin put the question to you. I think that all human beings whether they have the capabilities or they don't, belong to the human family, and with that come rights and dignity. So I would agree with the UDHR, but then I would ground animal rights, which is what you're also famous for, I would ground that in the same basis on the same platform, because ultimately you and I know that I have a moral duty to the wolf. If a wolf breaks in here and eats one of the three of us, or Liam Neeson, as in the film The Grey, the wolf hasn't actually acted immorally. It has no duties to us.
Well, because the wolf doesn't have the capacity to make those choices, and that's why I would agree that the wrongdoing of the various acts you described, whether it's burning the rainforest or torturing a cat or doing something to humans, is grounded in the fact that we have the capacity to make choices and to think what those choices are. So we have moral agency, I would say, rather than our dignity, I'd say, is what it's grounded in. And the wolf lacks moral agency. The wolf just behaves as a wolf, I guess, sees something it can eat and goes ahead and tries to kill it and eat it. So yes, there is a distinction between those humans capable of moral agency, which of course is not all humans. It's no babies are capable of moral agency, and non-human animals. But that's, I think, a different question from the question of whether, in terms of how we ought to treat them, we ought to put all humans, including the anencephalic, on a kind of higher plane by saying that they have rights that the others don't. And I think that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is trying to do.
Yeah, I was going to say what's interesting is I think actually if I'm going to be iconoclastic, Peter and I may be on more common ground here, because I've for a long time suspected that I think rights language bogs us down a number of ways. If we're in favour of trying to see that animals are treated more fairly, we somehow feel we need to sort of start assigning rights to members of the animal kingdom. And in fact, actually, the rainforest example was not a random one. I think it was Brazil recently. Some politicians there are arguing that rainforests should be granted rights in order to protect them from logging. And I remember reading this and thinking, this is rights language gone mad. What I do think is that we have duty and responsibility and an oughtness. And it was interesting, actually. One of the things that I did to prepare for this discussion, I was listening to the last time you were on the Unbelievable show, Peter, and you discussed with Christian philosopher Richard Weikart. And one of the things that Richard pushed you on was interesting. He pushed you on the sort of famous is-ought dilemma in ethics. And you said something to the effect of, I should have written it down. I was driving in the car at the time, so I wasn't able to take the notes. So I had to remember the gist of what you said. But you said something to the effect, I've spent most of my career trying to avoid the is-ought kind of issue. But then it was interesting, again, preparing for ought-based language is all over your work.
There's nothing wrong with ought-based language.
I ought to do X.
Of course.
Well, let me put this question to you in that sense then, Peter. So you believe in moral agency. You believe in that there is a right and wrong way to act with respect to other people and the whole of the living world. I think for many people like Andy would say, but where does that sense of moral duty come from, and what's it grounded in ultimately? Why should someone act in the best way they can towards, why should someone adopt a utilitarian principle when they could simply say, well, I don't want to do that? In a universe where there is a God, where there is potentially some sort of moral arbiter, some kind of moral lawgiver, one may be able to find a way to saying, well, that's where this duty, this oughtness about the universe comes from. In a universe where there is no God, I think a lot of people ask, well, what is that grounded in? How can we get to this sense that we should act in certain ways?
But let's go back to the claim that in a universe in which there is a God, then it's grounded. Are we to say it's grounded simply in the will of God, in the arbitrary will of God? This is an argument, of course, that goes right back to Plato. Are we to say that if God had willed that, in fact, we cut up babies and eat them on the barbecue, then that would have been the right thing to do? Because I certainly wouldn't want to believe that, and I don't know whether Andrew wants to believe that. But if you reject that, then you have to say it's not arbitrary that God tells us that it's wrong to torture babies and that it's better to be kind to them, because that reflects a more basic underlying truth. And if there is such a more basic underlying truth that it's better not to, let's say, gratuitously cause pain, then that's something that we have access to and that can ground our action.
And is independent of God. So it's, you seem to be stating Euthyphro's dilemma there, this idea that it's either...
You're right. Yes, you've picked up the reference well.
But essentially, yes, does God command the good because it's good, or is the good what we should do independent of what God commands? Okay, this is a common response to the so-called moral argument.
And it was interesting because Peter's so prolific, I refreshed my memory because I think the edition of Practical Ethics on my shelf was like an early one, perhaps not first edition, but I bought the more recent one on Kindle, and I'd forgotten. Of course, you had a reference in there early on to the Euthyphro dilemma. Slightly disappointed that you don't do much engagement with the literature, because of course, as many people have pointed out, the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma is actually found in Plato himself, because when Plato is positing that dilemma, he is using the word God and the gods really to describe the gods of Greek mythology, who are very much largely creatures within creation, very much they're physical beings. And then, of course, Plato puts forward the idea of the good, which in English we would probably tend to render that with a capital T and a capital G, who really is the kind of sort of metaphysical standard of goodness. It is the good. And Christian theists have always, generally since Augustine, connected those two and gone, aha, well, that's what Christian theism is talking about. It's not that God goes, well, what shall I command? Let's have some fun and command this. Or God looking to some standard outside of himself. But God is goodness, and therefore,
But for Plato, it's not a personal good. The good is not personal. Whereas
no, I agree.
Presumably for Christians, it is.
Christianity wants to act like morality needs God, but that argument falls apart fast. Developmental psychology shows that even 6- and 10-month-old babies can favor helpers over harmful characters before they understand religion. Fairness also appears outside religion. Capuchin monkeys reject unequal rewards, which points to moral instincts shaped by social life and evolution. Meanwhile, the Bible says God ordered the killing of infants in 1 Samuel 15:3. A book with that command has no right to lecture the world on moral truth.
I would absolutely agree with you there. That's a go. I think that's the difference.
So if I don't think, I could. I won't exactly accept Plato's metaphysics, but I could, let's say, well, yes, there is something that is objectively the good, and if you like, it always is there and it always would be there, has the potential to be there. So I could say it's timelessly true that to gratuitously inflict pain is a bad thing. But that doesn't get you anywhere in terms of saying there's a God, because this is not a personal being.
No, and that's a good question there. I mean, I would say a couple of things there, Peter. One is interesting. I forget where I read, but I read a recent interview with you where you made a comment to the effect of that you're just beginning to sort of nudge towards the idea that there may be standards of objective goodness.
Oh, I accept that. You're a few years out of date.
Yes.
Well,
it's not so much that. I read so much in the last.
Okay.
I think it was in the interview you did in 2016 with the Journal of Applied Ethics was where you were quoted as saying that, and I think that's interesting because actually I don't think you can avoid that. I mean, for example, Jeremy Bentham had the same issue. He ultimately had to admit the utility principle. You can't really give reasons for. You have to take it as a foundation, which is interesting that you raise Plato, because I really think you're forced with two choices. You either have to posit a kind of personal God, like the God of Christian theism, or this sort of Platonic realm of things such as, moral duties and those kind of things that are external to us and objective to us. They're discovered, and that was a question you raised at the start.
Well, I wanted to ask, because
yes.
I think it's important to get to this point. So you do believe at some level, Peter, in the idea of objective moral values and duties.
Yes. Yeah.
And those things exist independently of us, in a sense, and our evolutionary history and that.
Yes, the word exist could be misinterpreted, but perhaps you could say in a similar way to mathematical truths existing. And again, there's a lot of discussion among philosophers as to how you understand mathematics. But
and in that sense, then,
true too.
Rather than us inventing the things that we think are good, they actually exist independent of us. We discover them in that sense. And obviously, that seems to cohere, many would say, with Christian theism, the idea that there is a God who has, as it were, woven this into the fabric of the reality that we live in. But it's harder to reconcile with naturalism, which I assume is you do.
I'm not a naturalist.
You're not a naturalist. Okay, well, what are you?
I'm not a naturalist in the ethical sense.
Okay.
Right? I can describe myself as a naturalist in terms of understanding the universe, broadly speaking.
I see.
But not in every respect, perhaps.
Where does the realm then, if it exists, where is it?
When we're talking about ethics, naturalism is the idea that Andrew referred to before, that you can derive ought judgments from is judgments. In other words, that you can go from facts to values. I don't think that's true. I think that there are independent normative truths which as I say, I'm a little doubtful about saying they exist, if that suggests that in some sense there is a realm where these things could be discovered or seen. But I think that they're something that we have access to, as we have access to principles of logic or principles of mathematics. That if we're rational beings, we can understand them. And
that's interesting, because I meet many atheists who deny that altogether.
Yes, there's another view, which I did hold for a good bit of my career, which says that essentially when we make moral judgments, we're expressing attitudes, and these attitudes are not really true or false, or sometimes people say prescriptions. My former Oxford teacher, R.M. Hare, said that they're prescriptions, that we're prescribing things which again are not true or false, just as if I say to you, shut the window, that's not true or false, it's a command, it's not a description, it's not like saying the window is shut. So that is another possible position that many philosophers hold. And
what's led you to the belief that actually there really is this objective realm of moral values and duties?
So for a long time, I tried to reconcile the non-objectivist, if you like, the prescriptivist view with the idea that reason plays a role in reaching ethical conclusions. And I tried to do that broadly within the framework that R.M. Hare had set out. But eventually I concluded that couldn't really be done. And at the same time, I was persuaded by a number of philosophers. Derek Parfit is one who's been influential with me, Tim Scanlon, Tom Nagel, that it's reasonable to think that there are normative truths that are objective, that we don't have to go into any really weird metaphysics in order to accept that.
So we don't live in a world where we're all beholden to basically whatever anyone's opinion is on their particular morality. It's not subjective in this. We can say, if you're behaving wrongly, you ought to be behaving this way.
We can certainly say that, and I'd go further and say in saying that we're not just expressing our own attitude, like we're saying, I really like a lot of garlic in my spaghetti sauce, and someone else says, no, I don't like garlic. We're talking about something where there is a right or wrong answer.
So why for you should this make Peter at least open to the possibility of theism, Andy, rather than a sort of whatever, maybe Platonic realm?
Well, I want to say a couple of things before that, Justin. I mean, the first thing I want to say is I want to be very careful because in the context of this being a collegial discussion, it's very tempting for both Christians and for atheists to sort of try and find gotcha moments and go, ha ha, I've just got Peter admitting. And I want to be careful in doing that. What I want to then say as well, I also respect, I think, how Peter arrived at that position, because I think if you do say that ethical statements have no content, they're meaningless. I mean, that was something sort of right out of the whole sort of annals of logical positivism and A.J. Ayres and others. We end up with a very strange counterintuitive conclusion that somebody who decides they prefer helping the poor and giving lots of money away to help people in difficult parts of the world, that's no different from somebody who decides they want to, invade Eastern Europe and try and, start the Third Reich. And there's no difference between them. And that's so counterintuitive, something's got to be wrong with it. I also want to say as well that I think the other thing I think that's interesting around ethics is ethics requires grounding in a framework. I don't think you can do ethical statements like you could do mathematics. Ethics belongs in the context of relationships, and that's sometimes why ethicists go wrong. They kind of abstract things from the context of family and community and interpersonal relationships and try and sort of analyse them logically. And I think on this bigger question, the metaphysics behind it, the same applies. I don't think you can abstract ethics from some kind of bigger framework. Where I think things do get interesting, and where if I were on Peter's side of the table, I would at least be sort of scratching my head slightly, I think, is that if one is not careful, you do end up with, I forget which philosopher sort of coined this phrase, you end up with a sort of extravagant Platonism, that you have this realm, wherever you put it, in which we have moral values and duties, mathematical objects, other abstract objects, and it sort of grows and grows and grows and is full of these things, rather than for Christian theism to go, well, okay, we actually only have one sort of metaphysical object, as it were, which is God, and those things are grounded in the mind of God. Not least that's helpful because moral commandments do follow, but moral duties do follow between people. And so rather than thou shalt not murder floating around abstractly out in the void, doing nothing until human beings have evolved to such a point that suddenly it applies to them in the same way as the law of gravity applies to them, actually we have a divine person, and duties and so forth follow between persons. I think there's something around that intrigues me.
Objective morality does not save Christianity. The 2020 Phil Papers survey found that about 62% of philosophers accept or lean toward moral realism, while about 67% accept or lean toward atheism. That means many serious thinkers believe moral truth can be real without a God. Christianity then has a bigger problem. Its own Bible allows buying foreign slaves and passing them down as property in Leviticus 25:44-46. If that is supposed to be God's moral foundation, the foundation is corrupt.
Why does that not follow for you, that these duties and moral values should be grounded in something, I suppose, beyond ourselves in the form of God, ultimately?
Well, to answer that, we would have to get back to questions about whether there are reasons for us to believe that God exists. And especially as we're talking about morality and the claim that morality is grounded in the existence of God or the will of God, I do think you have to look at the world around you and you have to say there is an immense amount of suffering that goes on, which I don't believe an all-powerful, omniscient and good, morally good being would permit. Because this is not simply suffering that occurs to those who do bad things. It's not even if you were to believe what I think is a repellent doctrine of original sin, that all humans have sinned because Adam and Eve sinned, and therefore it's okay for us to be punished. Because even if you accept that, non-human animals not being descended from Adam would not have original sin, and yet it's clear that they suffer, and not only at the hands of humans. They suffer because I come from Australia, there's seasonal droughts. Out there in the arid centre of Australia, there are droughts, and many kangaroos and other animals will slowly die of thirst, a miserable death. I cannot for the life of me see why a good God would permit that. So
really, the fact that you can't place these moral duties and values in the framework of God is because there are other aspects of God that you just find can't bring you.
That's certainly a major reason for me. I mean, Andrew objected to extravagant Platonism and seemed to imply that belief in a God is somehow less extravagant. We could have a debate about what creates more metaphysical extravagance, and that would be another issue that we could raise. And also, I still haven't really heard Andrew's answer to the question of whether God is simply, whether the things that God says are good, they could have been different or not. I haven't. I know he said it's something part of the idea of goodness, but then.
Well, let's send this back to you, Andy, because absolutely. I think there's a couple of questions there.
There are.
This challenge over whether you can resolve Euthyphro's dilemma and whether God actually does command the good and so on, but also the problem of suffering. Peter says, God's not even on the table as long as the world we're in is the world that God has created, because I can't reconcile that with a God of love, as you seem to be able to.
There's a lot of good things in there, but let's take that latter one, Peter, because I think that's a hugely significant question. And of course, as a philosopher who is no slouch, you'll be aware that there's a whole branch of philosophy that deals with that from a range of perspectives, which is the whole branch of philosophy and theology known as theodicy. So I think it'd be interesting to do some digging into that if one's going to use that as an argument. What I find interesting is right from the word go that actually that brings a whole moral dimension to bear on the world that we live in, because of course our instinctive reaction hopefully our instinctive reaction, whether it's kangaroos dying of thirst in the centre of Australia, or whether it's a hurricane or whatever causing some kind of natural disaster, is we don't just view it coldly and dispassionately. We actually bring the ought to bear. It ought not to be like that. The world ought to be different, and that oughtness, as somebody once described, is a bit like the bubble on the wallpaper. You wallpaper a room and there's a bubble over here, and you push it down and it pops up over here. We can't seem to avoid making those kind of value judgments. Now, if that was all there was to say, then I think, if the Christian story was simply God is good and has created this world, and hey, isn't it wonderful? Then I think we'd have every duty to come along and go, well, hang on just a moment. But of course, that's neither the beginning of the story nor the end of the story. The beginning of the story is that something has gone wrong with creation. With all due respect, Peter, you slightly mischaracterize the Christian doctrine of original sin, which is not the reason the world is in the state it's in, is because God goes, because of Adam and Eve, I'm just going to kill those kangaroos, unless that's that's the AV, the Australian version.
Tell me what the right version is.
Rather than that's actually fundamentally twisted and broken creation, both our relationship with God and creation itself.
But if God is all powerful, why can't he fix it?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Before I get to that, I'd also point out, interestingly, I don't know if you're aware of, one of our most iconoclastic atheist philosophers here in the UK is John Gray, formerly London School of Economics. And John, either in his book Heresies or in Straw Dogs, I always forget which one this is found in, talks about the doctrine of original sin and the fall, and says, much as I disagree with much that Christians have said, he said that's actually the one thing I think Christianity has got right. Just look around you. Human beings are a badly broken animal. Now, your question about why does God allow it? Well, if God had simply sat there in heaven and done nothing about it, then I think we would be able to raise that very charge of going, well, it's all right for you. You're sitting up there in heaven. Life is pretty miserable down here. But of course, the whole of the Christian story is what God has and is doing about it in and through the cross and through Jesus. And whatever you make of Jesus of Nazareth, certainly the heart of the Christian story, you have the ability to go, the one thing you cannot pin on the God of the Bible is this is not a God who knows something, who knows nothing about suffering and injustice. And interestingly, Justin, that brings us full circle. Because one of the things I would also want to bring to the table as a Christian about human value and dignity is that value is also conferred by what somebody is prepared to pay. And in the God of the Bible, and in the cross and in Jesus, you have God making a tremendous statement about the value of human beings, such that he will be willing to go through that in the person of Jesus.
This is still very strange, right? Because if we believe that Jesus was God's son and God sent him to earth...
I most certainly do.
Right, so that happened about 2,000 years ago, right? And yet the world still has all of this suffering. So here's this supposedly all-powerful being who created the universe and everything, and who doesn't like the suffering that goes on, and who tried to do something about it 2,000 years ago, and yet the suffering is still going on. Doesn't seem to be really better. So it seems like he's a bungler. He made a bad mistake in thinking that sending his son to be crucified would somehow fix all the suffering in the world, and it plainly hasn't.
Well, actually, if I was going to be wonderfully sort of cheeky, I'd go, actually, Steven Pinker was sitting in that chair not long ago who says the world has got increasingly better in the last
well, but not as I agree with Steven Pinker about that, but not as much better as it ought to have got if we had an all-powerful all-good being.
But here's the interesting thing. That answer, I think, that question, of course, is raised right from the very beginning, because the first Christians who went out across the Roman world and began preaching the Christian message and saw Christians go from being 0.0008% of the Roman Empire to 51.2% in 312 years, they knew full well that Christians were thrown to the lions, that earthquakes happened, that disease happened, yet they still believed that God had come in the person of Jesus, risen from the dead, that was the death blow struck to evil, and that was the beginning of God's new creation and putting the world back together again.
A strange false belief, I think.
Well, interesting you say false belief. One of the things that intrigues me about the suffering question as well, and to go, this is a rabbit trail of its own, but I think it's a fascinating one. One of the things that began to intrigue me as I taught, university level courses on the problem of evil was it's a peculiarly Western question. It's not, that doesn't make it an irrelevant question, but when I would travel to the East, and I have many, many friends who are living in situations where they've experienced terrific suffering, persecution. I've met people who've lost their homes, their families, who've been tortured in prison for their Christian faith or experienced other things. These questions don't arise. It was pointed out after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami. It was Western newspapers that were running editorials with, "Where is God?" That question wasn't being asked.
But because they don't really believe in that God.
Christian excuses crash into the fossil record. Human beings appeared around 300,000 years ago, but cancer existed in dinosaurs 76 million years ago. So blaming suffering on human sin does not fit the timeline. Today, WHO estimates 4.9 million children under 5 died in 2024. That is not mysterious love. Romans 8:22 even admits creation is still groaning. An all-powerful God who leaves children and animals suffering has failed the moral test.
We believe the personal God that
Christians caught up in it would have been Christians would have, Muslims would have done. Those questions were not being asked, and that just tells me something. I think it tells me that whilst this is not an unimportant question, we forget that we all ask our question from a position. We approach our philosophy from a position, and we're approaching this as Westerners. And I think there is something when you draw that lens back, similarly historically, to go, if the problem of evil was such a spectacular argument against belief in a good God, then I think, as the Oxford professor C.S. Lewis famously asked, how did that belief ever arise in the first place? Men are crazy, but not as crazy as that. So I think we need to wrestle with the question, but I think it's actually a question for both atheists and for Christians to wrestle with, because it gets us to the issue.
I don't see why it's a question for atheists. I mean, we understand the world as having evolved from very simple beings, that we're not conscious. There's no plan to the world for an atheist evolutionary viewpoint. It's just happened through random mutations. And unfortunately, if you like, it's indifferent as to whether it causes suffering or not in terms of how things evolve. So I don't see why it's at all a problem for atheists that there is all this suffering.
Well, let me explain why. I think if atheists were simply content to leave it there, that would be one thing. But the fact that when natural disasters happen, we find atheists quick to use moral language.
Why should? Of course, and I've never denied that we should use moral language.
So where does the oughtness come from? It's just evolution doing her thing or his thing.
No,
or
it's
their
not
thing.
at all. Not at all. That would be the naturalistic fallacy, and that's why I said to Justin before, I'm not a naturalist. No, it's that we can understand as rational beings that gratuitous suffering is a bad thing, and that for beings to experience joy and pleasure and happiness is a good thing. And moral language follows from that. So I don't think there's any problem for an atheist in using moral language. And I think that problem, the problem of suffering, is therefore uniquely a problem for those who believe in a God who has these three attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, or goodness.
Well, let me bring it back to the issue of it not being a problem, Peter. You wrote, sorry, I was just digging on my iPad because I thought I actually wanted to read you something. You said, far from justifying principles that are shown to be natural, a biological explanation can be a way of debunking what seem to be eternal moral axioms. When a widely accepted moral principle is given a convincing biological explanation, we need to think again about whether we should accept the principle.
Yes, that's right.
And so
debunking explanation. That means we don't support the value that we might hold because it helped us to survive and reproduce. The fact that a value helped us to survive and reproduce doesn't prove that it's false, but should lead us to a certain skepticism.
Exactly. And in the same way that our instinctive reaction to when we see suffering in nature is, that's a terrible thing, we could debunk the same thing. In fact, A.J. Ayers, I think it was, who famously said, the debunker should be forced to wave his own debunking sword over his own cherished beliefs in public. And so I think actually evolution, when you apply it that way, becomes a universal asset.
I don't think it does, and I've argued, in fact, in a book called The Point of View of the Universe, that the idea of universal benevolence, the idea that, as the late 19th century utilitarian philosopher Henry Sidgwick said, from the point of view of the universe, the interests of each being can't the same if they're similar sorts of interests. That's something that you cannot explain in evolutionary terms, why we should hold that belief, because it actually would be more advantageous to our survival and reproduction if we said, no, beings who are not any kin of mine or not in a reciprocal relationship with me, their interests don't count. And of course, a lot of people do actually act on that, and it's not surprising given that we are evolved beings who descended from ancestors who succeeded in reproducing. It's not surprising that we should have tendencies to act on that. And when you referred to the idea of human nature as being broken, I think it's simply something that we can understand in evolutionary terms, why we do not act with universal benevolence to all. But as rational beings, I think we can see that would be the right way to act. So I think that's an ethical principle that is not debunked by evolutionary explanations.
I'm less so sure. I'm less sure. I mean, it was interesting. You mentioned there's some of the in your last comment around evolution there. One of my favourite. You mentioned Tom Nagel earlier. One of my other favourite iconoclastic philosophers is an Australian. Well, was an Australian, the late David Stove, who wrote a wonderful book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. I think really doing a fantastic job of debunking attempts to use evolution to get us any form of ethics. But although he has a nice little language he uses there, that we continually, people who want to wed their belief system purely in evolution, continually keep applying patches to the theory to try and come up with why human beings are altruistic. Because of course human beings seem to use altruism everywhere. On the other hand, you're criticizing human beings for not displaying care sort of equally to all. But actually, we have invented all kinds of ways of helping people who are not biologically connected to us. And if you're an evolutionary sociobiologist like E.O. Wilson, that causes you a tremendous headache. But one thing I think is interesting, I would like to pick you up on, is that a comment I made earlier about ethics and morality existing within relationships, and I think, of course, particularly where they exist is within familial relationships. So I think you've argued in several places that in theory there's no necessarily good moral reason for, if there's a house on fire and you could rescue your biological offspring or rescue someone else's offspring, why you should pick your own your own child. But you admitted elsewhere that in the case of your daughters, if there was a house fire, you'd probably grab those who were your kith and kin and not the others.
I'm sure I would, because I'm also a human who is descended from others who've evolved to have these strong feelings.
My question is, I'm not
children.
necessarily convinced that's a bad thing, because I think one of the things we've been dancing around a little bit in this whole discussion is, of course, if you look at classical ethical theory, if you take this back to Aristotle and the such like, we get into the issues that ethics is about character. In fact, ethics comes from the Greek word ethos that means character, and for Aristotle and many others, the key question will be, how do we build citizens and human beings who have a certain kind of character? Both your earlier preference-based utilitarianism and now the hedonistic utilitarianism that you would say is your framework, and the idea of promoting good and avoiding pain. I was sitting there thinking about this last night while feeding my son banana and peanut butter. We believe in good nutrition.
Very good healthy meal for your
yes,
son.
He rejected the salad, and so this was the only thing we would get Christopher to eat at 6:30 last night. But it suddenly occurred to me that in the context of my parenting relationship with my 3-year-old, sure, avoiding pain is certainly part of it. I shouldn't clobber him round the head with a frying pan when he puts his Lego bricks on the floor. But on the other hand, that is a remarkably thin ethic, because most of my parenting relationship with my son and my daughter is around how do I form them to be persons of character? How do I shape them and mold them, more so at first, and as they get older to the reins less tightly, because success looks like, for me, not a child who's happy. That's a good plan B or C, but a child who is good, a child who's noble, a child who is brave, a child who is self-sacrificial, all that long list, which would come under what the ancients called character. And I think one of my slight concerns with this whole kind of discussion is that we abstract ethics into this sort of zero-sum game of, adding up happiness points versus negative points, and the idea we should all be treating everybody absolutely equally, irrespective of our relationship to them, ignores those kind of familial settings, ignores the duty that we have to siblings, to spouses to who we've made commitments, and so on and so forth. Ethics can't be abstracted from close relationships and from character.
Would you agree with that, Peter?
This is where religion loses the argument. Atheism does not need to explain suffering as part of some holy plan. Nature is indifferent. Disease, disasters, and death happen because the universe does not care. Christianity has the harder problem. It claims a loving, all-powerful God is in charge, while pain continues. A +1 study found that non-believers still share moral concerns like fairness and protecting vulnerable people. So morality can come from reason and compassion without defending divine silence. So what do you think? Do we actually need God to be good? Or is morality stronger when it is based on reducing harm instead of obeying religion? Comment your answer below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.